When the Irvington Gazette first began in 1897, it was a finger and hand print sheet. This small paper took a lot of work to produce and was quickly discontinued because its publishers, Frank Morrell and Thomas Brown, were not able to maintain it. But while Brown found a career in other places, Morrell didn't give up on the Gazette and restarted it as a weekly newspaper in October of 1907 in his stationery shop at 81 Main Street. He was 34 years old, a printer by training who had apprenticed in the 1890s as a printer's devil in the Cosmopolitan building, then the plant for the Cosmopolitan magazine. He also served as a volunteer firefighter in the Irvington Fire Department. During the early years of the Gazette, Morrell served as both publisher and editor. He had at least one typesetter, Frank Morgan, who was a former co-worker from the Cosmopolitan days and a fellow volunteer firefighter. Nothing else is known about the Gazette staff but the paper's expansion from 4 pages to 8 by 1908 and its relocation to larger quarters at 100 Main Street in 1909 suggests its operations and staffing had increased to accommodate its production demands. Even so, it had only 2 cabinets of type, a jobbing press that handled small print jobs, and some other equipment. Whatever original content it generated was typeset by hand, and the paper as a whole was printed in New York City. During this period, the Gazette's coverage was modest at best, with very little Irvington coverage. It had the capacity to publish Morrell's editorials and some readers' letters to the editor. It could run advertisements and list tidbits of local news sent in by Irvington residents, but much of the given issue was usually made up of warmed-over ready-print filler items, such as stories and other articles pre-written, pre-typeset, and printed in the Gazette simply to fill space. The paper wasn't so much a forum at this point as a penny saver with the digested verbiage from outside sources. The Gazette somehow survived its first few years, likely due to the drive and tenacity of Frank Morrell to keep it afloat, his unshakable boosterism of Irvington, and the town's own pride in the paper's existence in name if not necessarily in content. Then, in late 1910, Morrell took a dramatic step. He incorporated the Gazette and took on 2 investors, Herbert Reynolds, a hardware store proprietor on 21 Main Street in Tarrytown, and Cyrus Bishop, an attorney with an office on 41 Main Street in Irvington. Reynolds became president and treasurer, and Bishop became secretary of the paper, while Morrell remained identified as editor. This was a partnership that lasted more than 25 years, and the Gazette's fortunes and scope improved immediately as a result. In an editorial on the April 7, 1911 issue, Morrell proudly announced, "We have just completed the work of installing a 2-revolution 4-roller printing press made by the Whitlock Printing Press Manufacturing Company, and a Dexter Folder Company newspaper folder, paster, and trimmer, together with a 3-horsepower electric motor for operating them." The April 7th issue was the first to be printed on-site in the Gazette plant at 100 Main Street. Its content, however, remained dominated by ready-print material for another few years. That began to change with the installation in 1916 of a linotype typesetting machine, an ungainly contraption whose invention in the 1870s revolutionized the entire printing industry. With its own linotype machine now, the Gazette's typesetting operation became automated. This enabled it to develop, typeset, and print local content efficiently in-house, and conversely to abandon most ready-print material. Over the next several years, the Gazette grew and flourished to become a respected community newspaper of record, focused primarily on Irvington and other Greenburgh towns and based on what was then state-of-the-art printing technology. It had a strong editorial voice and a robust engagement with its readers as events unfolded in the community or the world. At the same time, it maintained a humble self-identification as a community newspaper that couldn't and wouldn't compete with the dailies, be they local or national. The Gazette ran successfully on the strength of just this particular clarity of purpose. Frank Morrell died suddenly at the age of 62 in April of 1936. Months later, his partner Cyrus A. Bishop passed away as well, followed by his other partner Herbert Reynolds in 1946. The paper then underwent several changes in stewardship. The longest tenure was that of the Roy family, beginning in 1937 with Malcolm M. Roy, Irvington's then 48-year-old town council and a founder of Sunnyside Federal Savings and Loan. Originally a journalist, Roy shifted to practicing law after obtaining a law degree in 1922. He and others started Sunnyside Federal in 1930, and he was its president twice over the course of 2 decades. When he bought the Gazette in 1937, he served as its publisher for the next 12 years. He subsequently established the Tappan Zee Press, formally listing it as a publisher of the Gazette in 1949. He remained listed as the paper's editor until his death in January 1960. His son, Donald M. D. Roy, was listed as publisher by February 16, 1961. Another son, Malcolm D. Roy, intermittently edited the paper from 1967 onward. With each change in stewardship came changes in the Gazette's editorial coverage and physical location as the paper's staff and technologies evolved. Its move in 1937 to 56 Main Street, 3 blocks west of Frank Morrell's old plant, took more than 2 weeks to complete because of the scale of its news operations and equipment. 13 years later, the paper announced that since its removal to the 56 Main Street building, 2 automatic presses, besides folding and stitching machinery and other necessary equipment, had been added to the plant to make it one of the best in the country outside of the cities. Its next relocation, in 1950, 5 blocks east to a former garage on 10 Aqueduct Lane, occurred because the Gazette, which had much modernized equipment since the war, now found it necessary to move to still larger quarters. It was, in fact, 4 times the size of the space at 56 Main Street. Newspaper work in the last century was a loud and often messy business. The Gazette's operations were no exception. Irvington resident Bob Riley, who worked part-time at Aqueduct Lane as an Irvington high school student in the early 1950s, recalls,
"There was whatever the printing material is.
Ink.
When it runs through a press, it's like it's going boom.
Some years later, Malcolm Roy's own grandson, Jim Roy, also worked there as a teenager. According to him,
it was a big open area. It has just a small office when you first came into the building on the right-hand side through a door. And I know there were 2 big garage doors that would open up. I know in the summertime it was hot.
running the Aqueduct Lane operation was a small crew of people that included various Roys and 3 full-time workers. Among them was Lewis Bennett, who, as a mechanical superintendent, ran one of the linotype machines and oversaw the production process. When students like Bob Riley and Jim Roy were recruited, their work varied. They were there to help out in whatever way was needed. When Bob Riley started in 1951, he was 17 years old and did a little bit of everything, including errands and cleanup. In 1961, Jim Roy, then also 17, photographed Irvington High School games for the Gazette using a camera that belonged to his aunt, the Gazette managing editor and Donald's wife, Margaret Roy. A few years earlier, Jim's grandfather brought him in to help with distribution.
We would have to fold the papers so that we could mail them to everybody in town. Technically, I was probably too young to do it, but it was a family.
But even a family as devoted to Irvington as the Roys could not sustain the town's newspaper indefinitely. Signs of trouble began to surface a few years after Jim went to college in 1962. The paper's format shrunk to compact size in 1964, its advertising revenue declined, and in May 1967, Jim's uncles, Donald and Malcolm D. Roy, sold the paper to Hilda Berkowitz of Joe Marr Publications Incorporated, but she quickly bowed out as publisher and editor some 8 weeks later. On July 20th, 1967, the paper ran a front-page notice from the staff of the Gazette saying, "We understand the reports of our deaths circulated in the village earlier this week, but we are happy to say that such reports are unfounded." With that issue, Malcolm D. Roy took on a temporary role as editor for this issue for the next several months until such time as any prospective purchasers could make an offer. Sadly, that offer never came. In late August 1969, 62 years after Frank Morrell launched the Gazette and 32 years after Malcolm Roy the Sr. brought it into the modern age, it ceased publication. The reasons cited in the final issue were rising costs to produce the paper and a lack of advertising interest in the weekly field. The Aqueduct Lane plant, by then simply known as the Gazette Building, closed down, fell into disuse, and stood vacant for several years. The final disposition of its equipment, as well as its undoubtedly voluminous office files and records, is unknown. Over 3,000 issues of the paper itself still remain, however, and are housed in the Irvington Historical Society's archives. They are also accessible in digitized form online at HRVH Historical Newspapers.